Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Mitchell. I am the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. Today's webinar is part of our Infrastructure Innovators series, which brings together leaders from across the infrastructure space to share fresh ideas, innovations, and technologies that can help transform the way we plan, build, and manage infrastructure in Canada. Before I introduce our speakers, please remember you can post your questions. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to some of those at the tail end of the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can. I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers from Technomics Canada, Michael Lionais, Managing Director, and Peter Weltman, Director of Business Development. Today, they will walk us through Technomics' team of experts known as Technomicians, who use decades worth of North American project data to provide cost risk forecasting for major infrastructure projects. This aims to help decision makers reduce risk, improve transparency, and deliver more successful outcomes. So enough from me. With that, I'm very pleased to have with us today Michael and Peter, and I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everybody. Thank you for those of you who are on Eastern Time or East sharing your lunch hour with us, or maybe beyond. And on the West Coast for sharing at least an hour of your day with us. We appreciate it. And we think you're going to get something out of this too. Very quickly, as you know, governments are responsible for large critical infrastructure projects. And across the country, we're building roads, transit, hospitals, homes, but we're a little bit behind where we should be and where we need to be getting to. As we've seen too, projects have become a lot more complex. They become a little later, a little more over budget. This is not going to help us gain confidence with taxpayers. We need to do a better job. We're here to help change that. Next slide, please. I'm Peter Weltman, and with me is Mike Lionais. Together, we have decades of experience in government finance and private sector procurement. I was the former Financial Accountability Officer of Ontario, and I was recently appointed as the Vice Chair of the Canadian Infrastructure Council.
Hi, I'm Mike Lionais. I had a military and public sector career before joining the private sector. The last 7 years of my public sector career were as the Director General of Costing, User Fees and Transfer Payments for the Government of Canada. And I also went on interchange with CPA Canada to work on the future of the accounting profession, which in short is data science. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you. All right, so now you know who we are, but what is Technomics? So here's a video to learn a little bit about who we are and what we do. Now, we've had a little technical glitch just about 10 minutes ago. We rehearsed this a few times over the course of the week and it was fine. So it's like in the old days when you had to remember to bring an extra light bulb with you when you're using an overhead projector. I'm not sure how many folks in the room would remember that. I certainly do. This is our attempt at the extra light bulb. So please, Rachel, try to play the video and we'll see what happens. I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and we're now going to get into some of the details of the work that we have done in each of these project areas. Mike?
Thanks, Peter. So this is describing a rather large infrastructure project that was in the multiple tens of billions of dollars in terms of what the authority that was sought from the government of Canada to initiate the project. They did a much lower amount that was recently announced in under 10 billion, but it's a massive undertaking. We were asked to validate the engineering buildup. So the engineers had taken about 12 months to do a requirements-driven cost estimate. We were asked to give Canada confidence of whether the number was valid or reasonable or not. We weren't told the number, and we were asked to do it with publicly available data. And so we did it in about 6 weeks, and we came within 5% of the engineering buildup. And most of that time was spent sourcing data in order to align the characteristics of the infrastructure project to the source or the data we use from the publicly available information to create the estimate. When I looked at our analysis, what I found most interesting, putting on my old Director General of Costing hat, was the quantification of the risk register. What we identified was that there was retained, shared, and transferred risk. At the 50th confidence interval, which is equally likely that the risk will happen or not happen, it was 18% retained, 2% shared, and 24% transferred, which was quite enlightening to me. And when I looked at the risk adverse position, and that was at the 80th confidence interval, it was 22% retained, shared stayed 2%, and the transferred risk grew to 28%. And I found that incredibly powerful because it gave me a sense of what the risk register would be, notwithstanding what the bid value was going to be, because it's a ratio of the bid value. Anyway, the CFO is quoted there, and we helped challenge and refine his thinking by looking at the cost estimates and what was driving the costs in the cost estimates. Anyway, Peter.
Thanks, Mike. So again, it's a different way of looking at cost estimating than the traditional engineering build-up. The next opportunity to demonstrate how we've saved clients some money is at stage 2, helping to evaluate bids for viability. So viability really is about can the bidder deliver the project on time and on budget and on requirement? So I, as a buyer, get value for money. And can the bidder realize a reasonable profit return on sales? That's equally important. So sometimes, as we've seen with some of our clients at Defense, some bids come in that are the lowest bid, but in reality, when you unpack them, they're going to be the highest bid because there's a lot of risk in there that they're either absorbing but not showing to the government, or that they plan to transfer to the government but haven't been transparent about it. So an independent cost model can identify the baseline forecast and allows for better comparison of bids. So when there's some variation in the bidding, then you have a chance to look at the individual pieces of the bid and compare them against your own validated forecast and try to unpack what's going on. Next slide, please.
You know the problem. There are a multitude of challenges when negotiating a contract for a complex infrastructure project. You also know the objective: avoid the bad deal. Why? Because we all know you can't manage your way out of a bad deal. So what's the solution? Shoot for a win-win, both the buyer and the seller. Be laser focused on contract risk up front during the negotiation phase. Sounds good in theory, but how do you get there? Well, that's what we do. Technomics helps get the cost baseline right from the get-go using state-of-the-art risk analysis techniques. Get the geometry right to include basis of payment, target costs, target profit, contract ceiling, and the like. The payoff: acceptable cost and risk to all parties, return on sales that meets or exceeds the hurdle rate, and generates free cash flow on the invested capital. That's where we can help. And if you're off plan, you'll see it coming and you'll be ready.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Good. So some key elements of successful projects. We're going to spend a little bit of time walking through some of the work we've done in this area. I'm going to just turn over to Mike. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Peter. So we've been talking a lot about the importance of the foundation, so a data-driven estimate. We were hired to take a look at overhead costs and what was driving cost growth post-contract award in a specific infrastructure or asset development. It was actually a shipyard. We had a look at the shipyard, made some interesting conclusions, wanted to publish it, but realized we could not publish it. It would be obvious who the client was. So we went to our American office, and the American office agreed that this was really insightful and they wanted to take a look at it. So they repeated the work using 38 different contracts that we had from the beginning to the end of the acquisition phase. And what we were looking to discover was what triggers cost growth post-contract award. So after you've agreed it's going to cost you $1 billion to do it, why does it end up at $2 billion? And we found that it's really these 6 factors. So how stable were the requirements? Did you understand what you were asking the contractor to bid on? And did the contractor understand what you were asking them to bid on? Did you have complete market competition, or did you create a monopoly? If you create a monopoly, costs invariably grow. What was the technology and stretch involved in this? Infrastructure projects are becoming incredibly complex. You're no longer just laying rail, it's now an IT system with rail associated with it. Just like a ship is an IT system or an aircraft is an IT system. Nothing is what it was 20 years ago. It is all high tech. The contractor readiness to actually adopt the high tech solution can be not ready, right? They've never done it before. It's a state of the art, it's prototype, or it's routine in Europe, but we've never done it in Canada. And then there's 2 ways to constrain. Do you understand what it should cost in terms of a price validation? And do you understand how long it should take in order to do this? Because schedule slippage drives cost. So with these factors, you can actually build models to predict how cost growth could or may not happen. Not every project will grow post-award, some will, and this is a way to figure it out.
So thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
We did do a paper on this. Our company does regularly publish studies in this area, cost, risk, a bunch of different areas. We do a lot of work in software costing as well. This is a paper that's available in the public domains, and it won a Best Paper Award at the International Cost Estimating Conference a couple of years ago. If anybody's interested, just email me afterwards. I'll send it to you. And now that we're on the next slide.
So one of the questions people say is, why can't we forecast the risk? And part of it is our system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. So we tend to use activity-based costing. Activity-based costing was designed in the 80s for a manufacturing environment, which generally has tight input costs. So when you average, you're not really giving up that much. And when you add contingency to an average, you're sort of moving things along on the basis of a benchmark, but it's not truly data-driven because you're taking all the data out. So what you'll see on this graph is we show ABC as the first vertical black line on the left, and then there's a lighter black line beside it, which shows ABC with contingency. And then you'll see a series of curves. The first one shows the cost base, which takes the ABC value and includes the uncertainty in the data that was averaged to create a point estimate. With the retained risk, or the cost base, we then add the retained risk. So this is taking the risk register and actually identifying all the risks, quantifying them, putting them into a different type of distribution, and then modeling them. And you'll see the retained risk, and then the shared risk and the transferred risk. My experience in government as a Director General of Costing, well, most of the cost overruns came from lack of transparency around shared and transferred risks. Often the government thought they had transferred the risk to the contractor. The contractor couldn't take the risk. And so they were transferring the risk back to the government, but it was not transparent. And you'll see that when you look at the graph, that once you start factoring in all the elements of risk, the number is typically quite a bit further out to the right. Peter?
Thanks. One more for you. You're not off
right.
yet.
Sorry about that. Next slide. So when you're looking at bid viability, so we took that graph and we sort of split it apart in order to make it easier to see. So the first black line is sort of the uncertainty in the model. The blue line in the middle is with the retained risk, and then the light green line is with the transferred risk. What you would want to see when you're looking at a bid in terms of if you're the government and you want to assess its viability, is somewhere on that blue curve, and that there is a probability that the company can deliver the product for what they're saying. And that's the retained risks are covered, and ideally there's residual profit, so the company is a going concern. If you're in government, what you want to understand is the risks that are transferred to you, and that is the light green line. And that's what you should be going and asking your decision makers for the authority to actually have in the kitty in order to actually undertake the project. You would not fund the contractor with the full amount that you've sought for your authority, but you would hold it in reserve. And if not required, it would be returned what we called at the federal level, the fiscal framework, to offset deficits and other pieces or contribute to the surplus, depending where you are in the cycle. Anyway.
Is it fair to say that that transferred risk pieces can often lead to project delays and or claims at the end of the project?
Yes. So what would often happen with projects is they would have to go back and seek a new authority from government, a new budget from government. Stop using government speak. So a budget from government. That takes time. It can result in delays. The project doesn't stop when the delay happens. Burn rates keep going for salary. If you've rented equipment, you keep the equipment on site. But unfortunately, your time to complete the project on schedule shrinks as the decision makers deliberate. And I've heard of cases where the equipment has had to be returned before the project is finished. So they had to rent other equipment, which then becomes an unforeseen risk, which increases the cost again. So there's all sorts of cascading impacts around risk.
Thanks, Mike. Next slide, please. Okay. We'll get into how we actually worked with our client who was putting a bid on a very large project to, as we examined the requirements against what the bid was and how we were able to help them reduce the bid by $150 million.
Sure. So in this bid, the bid value was slightly below $10 billion, and there were 25 different contract line identification numbers. In one specific CLIN, there was a series of requirements that were identified with a series of constraints. The supplier had developed a proposal, and they had actually over-delivered against the requirement. We were able to use Monte Carlo simulation using the requirements and the constraints and different factors on the equipment in terms of what its utilization rates would be to demonstrate that they had over-purchased the equipment to deliver the service. And we were able to reduce the equipment substantially, saving them $150 million. We did this analysis in 36 hours. It shocked the decision maker. And then we spent the remainder of the week that we were working on this, doing what if scenarios and proving the math to the decision maker. In the end, they went with our solution and saved themselves $150 million in the proposal, and ultimately won the bid, sorry.
So I'm just going to explain it a little different way. So this was a throughput discussion. And what we did is we demonstrated that there was a math-based way to optimize on the throughput. So it's not, when you think about it, it's not complicated. If you have to move something through, let's say, a production process, you have a certain amount of capacity within that factory. You don't need a whole bunch of extra capacity. You just need this much. What happens in costing in the theory is that often folks, subject matter experts, are relied upon to provide advice on the size of that factory. And often it's based on their past experience, or it could just be, a guess, again, based on past experience. And what we bring is a different approach. We bring a math-based or a data-driven approach to calculate the throughput and to optimize the size of that factory. Good, let's get into bid evaluation. Next slide, please. So this is where we help build complex models to more effectively refine cost estimates. We talked about a little bit about that. We've done this in the sole source example that I showed earlier, but Mike's going to get into a little bit more of the mechanics. Next slide, please. Of how we use risk to demonstrate bid viability.
Right. So in this circumstance, there was a 50,000 row cost model consisting of 12 different contractors, 11 or 10 subcontractors, or 11 subcontractors and a partner or a prime. And 50,000 row cost model with 21 tables is just too large to manipulate. So we created a mini model and link the risk register into the mini model. We use Deltek Acumen in this specific example, but there's other Excel add-ins that you could use to create the S-curves that you see in the top right-hand corner. We then use that to create cost estimating relationships, or in this case, profit estimating relationships. And you'll see in the bottom table that shows type and then different profit levels. So in the initial proposal was at the P30, which is aligned to the academic theory, and it looked like there was going to be an 8% profit. But as you moved up and incorporated the risk and moved further to the right, when you got to the P50, which is an optimistic scenario, there was suddenly a loss of 20%. And when you got into the conservative or pessimistic scenario of P80, suddenly they were losing 50%. So you can see the bid wasn't viable once you started factoring risk into the bid, and it would have been rejected. We were able to correct that.
Next slide, please. So this is an example of an evaluation that we did on a sole source, starting on the left, working our way across. Again, because we have our own models and because we have access to that database of previous projects, we're able to model a future project that is similar in many respects. I mean, ultimately, most projects share more similarities than they don't. And it's a matter of really identifying on a costing side which of those non-similarities, if you will, that can be very significant in terms of cost schedule risk implications. So in this case, we were able to reduce the bid by $88 million. Now, this is a different example than what might be called value engineering. So that certainly happens a lot. I think of value engineering as de-scoping, but maybe others would take issue with that. This is really looking at, okay, so you're bidding for this particular defense system. It's a certain type of technology. You're bidding a certain type of labor. Well, on previous projects using a similar technology, the labor cost was a little different, or the scale of the labor was different. So maybe you're bidding at the highest level on the scale, and maybe we've seen this project executed at lower levels on the scale of labor, at less expensive labor, et cetera. So that's what our techniques allow you to get into. Next slide, please. Okay, so slide after that, this is project review. But before I move to that, I'm just going to mention that we're getting close to the end, but we do have a neat little thing we want to show off right after we finish. So, it's like the Steve Jobs, wait, there's one more thing. So we'll come back to that. Next slide, please.
Right, so this is a factor that you saw in the beginning when I showed the 6 factors that create cost growth post-contract award. And really, cost overruns really happen if you can't constrain or understand what's happening. So the independent cost estimate is actually vital. Canada, or CPA Canada, gave the government of Canada an award in 2014 for the adoption of the CFO attestation. What the CFO attestation is it's 6 assertions related to the integrity of the data, to the decision point, the risk identification, the funding availability, and a variety of 3 other factors. And ultimately, the CFO is saying that the proposal is suitable to the decision point. And really, this is important so that you can ensure you're getting value for money, and that you're using data that's appropriate to the decision point. You're using methodologies that are appropriate to the decision point. This will help industry as well get the return on sales. And why I'm discussing this is Canada has a habit of using an engineering build-up or a bottom-up build when it's inappropriate at the early stages of a project. And really, they should be using other techniques. And that's dependent on the availability of data. So the image that you're seeing is actually from the General Accountability Office Cost Estimating and Analysis or Assessment Handbook. And it's a 430-page document on the best practices in cost estimating and risk assessment. And this is a vital portion of it.
Thanks, Mike. I just want to jump in here. So the GAO, which is kind of equivalent to our Auditor General of Canada, but it's a lot more robust, it's a lot bigger, publishes a lot of these guidelines because the US spends an awful lot of money on stuff, and especially in the defense sector. And there are a lot of rules and best practices that have been developed over the many generations of defense spending to manage cost. So they're spending $700–800 billion a year. So other departments and agencies in the US government generally do not have the same level of rigor. When we move to Canada, we find that because of the size of our spend, there are some areas of government where they do introduce a little bit more rigor, and some where it's not. But we're generally behind. A lot of my time at FAO and PBO was working on the ICEA chapter to help bring government to a higher standard of cost estimating capability than was there before. Next slide. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, so this is our last example. We're going to talk a little bit about some work we did during a project and project review as a third party.
Yeah, so in this case, this was an asset under construction that's about $500 million. And the funding request came in partway through the bid saying we're going over budget and we need additional funding. So we didn't use any of our own data. We used only the data that was provided by the contractor to do the analysis for the Government of Canada. And what we determined was that the cost that was being requested actually didn't fit on the S-curve. It was at the 103% confidence interval. And so it was overstated by 23%. And that was hundreds of millions of dollars, pulling it down to closer to the 500 million mark. It also identified, using their data alone, that the slip at that point would be 18 months. The actual slip was about 20 months, but at that time we showed that it was 18 months using their data. Why the slippage is important is it generates cost overruns, as we've understood, but it's also the integration of the asset into the portfolio. If the asset is delayed, they have to keep older assets in service and increase cost to other parts of the budget of the Government of Canada. And it also has a cascading impact on other assets that we're trying to bring on and integrate to the portfolio. I'm speaking in code there, but I think you get the idea. I can't really talk about what the specific asset is. Peter, over to you.
All right, thank you. So bottom line, next slide, please. Real quick, stage one, we did a quick ROI, 1,500%. Stage two, 60,000%. Stage three, 17,600%. Stage four, 30,000%. I know they're crazy numbers, and most of it is cost avoidance. But effectively, what we're trying to get across is we can do a little bit of work and save folks not just a lot of time and money, but also provide some transparency, some insight into the types of risks and uncertainties that are widely prevalent in these complex projects. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the next slide, please. This is we've been playing around with this a little bit. So what this is about is this is a proprietary AI data-driven technology. So it enables program analysis on cost, region, and stakeholder group right away. We developed this in advance of the election, thinking, and because we have spent some time in Ottawa, there's always changes when a new government comes in, and I think we're going to see changes regardless of which government comes in the public service and the operations of government. So we developed a tool that we thought would be useful to public servants who need to readjust the operations of government to better line up with the strategy of the newly elected incoming government. And that's what this does. This is a tool to help identify pockets of the organization that are not in alignment with strategy. What we've done here is we've used government because it's complex. And then what we've done is we've used some AI tools to rank the level of consistency between the objectives and outcomes of that operation in question with the overall strategy in order to determine if there are excess, if there are funds available to move from one part of the operation to the other to align the entire operation more closely with the strategy. So we're going to play a little video to help show how it works. No. Back up, back up. Not this one. One more, back up. Try to click on the, there you go.
Let's test a program analysis in the details section. To ward off tariff threats, leaders should gain an understanding of Canada's commitment to border security. For this analysis, select Canada Border Services Agency. Here, you'll find a breakdown of programs, overall expenditure, individual program costs, and whether that program aligns with the values of Canadian political parties and those of the current United States government administration. Here, we see Canada spends $117 million on intelligence and collection analysis of immigrants, refugees, tourists, and foreign visitors, which is a policy that aligns strongly with the Conservatives at a score of 5, somewhat strongly with the Liberals and United States administration with a score of 4, but significantly weaker with the NDP at a score of -2. Agreeing to maintain or improve this program could win favor in tariff negotiations.
Thank you. So that's just an example in a very specific context. We actually were having discussions yesterday with the client to help them increase their throughput to meeting contractual requirements by using a technique somewhat analogous to this. So there's all kinds of neat things happening here at Technomics, and we'd be happy to share more of that thinking with you as we go forward. I think at this point, Mike, unless there's something else that you wanted to leave our audience with, we can move to questions.
No, let's move to questions.
Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate the presentation. There's a couple of questions, just a reminder for the audience that there is a Q&A function, and there are a couple of questions that have popped up that I'll get to, but maybe we can just sort of start just in terms of some of the stuff that we've kind of seen in the presentation. So it's introducing really a new methodology for cost and risk analysis in Canada. But we know today that companies are already doing schedule and risk forecasting, but maybe it's not done together. Maybe it's done separately. So can you talk a little bit about what the benefits of bringing the analysis together are?
Yeah, so in bringing the analysis together, you get a much better sense of what is driving the risk. So, and how they actually tie together. And if you can take small steps, you may be able to turn off or eliminate, reduce the impact or divert future pieces. One of the sort of the interesting analogies I've heard is about somebody moving a rail line 3 feet for a safety reason and costing 300 million because of easements further down. So what the integration of the risk does is it talks about how things are tied. And so if you move this, it has a cascading impact throughout the system. And doing it mathematically allows you to actually do what if scenarios and understand, what's happening and move from parametrics as we've done it to bottom up, but also then move back to a parametric when you're actually in production to keep management apprised of what's happening. And so there's a constant inflow of information about where the risks are, what's driving the risks, how they're materializing, how costs are changing, and how you could take measures or steps in order to start bringing things back in line before you're way off track. If you're waiting and you're doing this on a monthly basis on the results of your EVM, the horse will be gone and you'll be closing the barn door.
Can I ask, the three of us have public sector backgrounds, but largely I would guess, given who I know is in the audience, they do not. So maybe we could pull back the curtains a little bit and explain what maybe you mean by not going back to the ministers or Treasury board all the time. Because I think to a lot of folks in the private sector, government processes are a bit of a mystery.
Sure, I'll start on that one. These are fun. So typically in any kind of a procurement or any kind of an expenditure, depending on the size of the expenditure, it's not a lot different than a private company having to get board approval on something, on some kind of endeavor, because it represents a certain amount of risk to the organization. And as the risk gets larger, obviously the decision has to happen at a higher level. So it's the same idea in government. But what government does a little slightly differently is that when you go into government for, let's say I am defense and I want to buy a ship, the ship's going to cost me $1 billion. I have the authority to approve expenditure up to 200 million, but if I have to go higher than that, I've got to go to Treasury Board. So Treasury Board is a collection of ministers who basically approve any significant government expenditures. So in a nutshell, that's how it works. And if I'm coming into Treasury Board, I'm saying my ship's going to cost $1 billion. and they say, okay, fine, here's $1 billion. We'll set aside $1 billion in what we call the fiscal framework or in the budget to, make sure you have access to that $1 billion when you need it. So then finance, whether it's provincial or federal, goes back. They make the adjustment to the fiscal framework because they know they're going to have $1 billion hitting on the framework over a certain period of time. 6 months later, I come back and I say my contractor, who I told to get ready a year ago, hasn't done anything, and we're beating them over the head, but we're going to probably have to need another couple $100 million because there's unforeseen risks. And then Treasury Board will get angry, and the ministers are not going to be happy about this. So it's a back and forth. And this has been happening a lot, not just in Canada, but in Ontario. I know this firsthand from when I was FAO. And it's tiring for everybody. It's really annoying to go back to ministers because there's a lot of work involved before, just as there would be before going to a board. And ministers lose a lot of faith in the person or the organization that keeps coming back with their hand open asking for more money. And what we are hoping to do, and what I am personally hoping we can help with, is to reduce the number of trips by being more transparent up front, by having a better handle on the cost and risk, and being able to go into the board the first time and say, it's $1 billion. We know that the contractor has probably got a couple $100 million here that they are probably thinking they're going to share with us, but we're not going to take it on. Or there might be another 100 million that they simply can't handle, that we're going to need to be able to be prepared to handle down the road. So I'm just apprising you, ministers, you might give me $1 billion. I might have to come back for more. You can give me 1.1. I'll keep that 100 million set aside to mitigate what I think there's, a risk that's coming down the road. But the ministers might not want to do that in the same way the board might not want to, because that ties up $100 million that could otherwise be invested, spent, deployed elsewhere. So it's that back and forth, it's that optimization. And the more often you go to ministers, the more it reduces trust, the more crisis communications you have to put up with, and the more costly your project. Does that make sense to
I think so. I mean, as someone who used to write briefing notes for, processes, there's a lot. It's not just, but I think you're right. It's not just the process itself and the data. There's an entire machinery behind those types of processes that go on in government as well too, that take time. I think, they teaching and educating Treasury Board and, and other sort of, government processes about sort of the nature of these types of projects and how things evolve, I think is really key as well too. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm gonna touch on if that's okay with you guys. There's a question about the relationship between Technomics and the value engineering organization in Canada, VAC in Canada, and then SAVE in the USA, as well as whether you consider value analysis engineering in your services.
So I would suggest in Canada, we don't have a formal relationship with that organization. And in terms of value engineering, yes, we would consider it. But we don't view the proposal as a de-scoping. What we're looking at is, has something been over the requirements? So our job is not to second guess the solution in terms of what are we going to cut? What we're suggesting is something may be more robust than it needs to be. And we're engineers and accountants and economists and a variety of others in the teams. So we actually don't make that decision. What we may also identify is that there may be trade-offs. So how do you schedule or plan a de-scoping if you're going to have cost overruns or schedule slippages that lead to cost overruns, and you can't deliver the full suite without incremental funding from the decision maker? There may be a requirement then to trade some of the capability for delivery on budget and on time. So those are the types of analysis that we do.
And the sorts of value engineering, I would see us as a support role, either for the owner or for the bidder, as the different scenarios are developed. We could help identify, again, key cost drivers, significant points where there could be some changes made, and be able to assess the size of the reduction or the change and the risks associated thereof. So while we're not engineers, we're not doing drawings, we are doing effectively math-based drawings. So data-driven math-based drawings that we can adjust as those permanent drawings start to evolve.
So just to pick up on that, Peter, there's a question here about so it says cost, schedule, productivity, and crew makeup is not linear. So how do you take these types of things into account if you're looking at it from a mathematical perspective?
There's a variety of techniques that we can use. And without getting into a more specific example, we're not limited by Excel. We use all sorts of different solutions in order to build out. And most of the things that we're doing are multivariable. And there's all sorts of connections and correlations. So we're using advanced mathematics to actually solve it. I'm not really answering the question, but it's not, we're limited to adding and subtracting. We actually get into advanced mathematical equations to develop cost estimating relationships based on different characteristics of the item in order to understand, and it could be profit estimating, schedule estimating, basically build out relationships based on the data.
So a lot of it is statistical analysis, and most of it, frankly, is data and data cleansing, validating data, and then working with the data using a variety of statistical tools to identify the areas of interest and to identify the distribution of the impact of those areas of interest.
We'll take a couple more questions from the audience, and then I've got one myself that I'll do, and just that I've got that's I think very topical. That I'll do just before we wrap up. But what are your thoughts on the use of earned value analysis to monitor costs during project execution?
Foundational. So we do earned value management. We set up earned value systems. We think they're invaluable to management, particularly if you move it from a lagging indicator into a leading indicator.
Yeah, so we do a lot, excuse me, we do a lot of work in that, is to be able to use EVM data to project where we think things are going with the project. But yeah, simple answer is invaluable. It's a lot of work to set up. It's a lot of work to maintain. So it's not for every project. Obviously, you need to have the scale, but it's invaluable, especially on the large stuff.
And we only have a couple of minutes left, but I think, there's something that's been top of mind for me, and I think top of mind for a lot of people, given what's happening with our neighbors in the South. So a question for you guys then is, how would you assess the volatility in tariff starts and pauses, given our current circumstances?
That's a tough one, because in some respects, COVID probably is the most recent example of significant volatility, but that was a little different in scope. In that case, you had, governments effectively shutting down work sites, contractors depending on output from those work sites, but there was nobody there to produce. So there was some unanticipated consequence of a tail event. This is a tail event as well. But I think, it comes back to risk transfer, risk sharing. So doing some work around volatility of whether it's tariffs, and what those input costs will be, and trying to determine who's best to handle those crazy swings. And in this case, I would argue that a lot of this stuff is going to be probably a government transfer. So there's a lot of issues that government's best. I mean, maybe the easiest thing to explain is foreign exchange. We've seen that a lot, certainly in defense. Foreign exchange can be hedged to a certain degree by corporations, but ultimately it's a government that's buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of foreign exchange. There aren't too many companies out there doing that. So often I've seen in defense, or I've encouraged in defense contracts, I haven't actually seen it, is to not lay on the cost of Forex on D&D, to allow the Ministry of Finance to manage some of it in the same way that you wouldn't lay it all on a contractor. You might lay on the first 1 or 2% move in the currency. Maybe that's something they can hedge with effectively. But afterwards, it really needs to be transferred to somebody who can afford to handle.
And I'll add to that. So rather than just focus on the risk of the tariff, you may want to get into an anticipation that the tariff may be coming in. So you saw the video there of Policy Pulse. It's a large language model enabled analytical tool using multiple large language models. So what we could do as well is set up an early warning system that would flag what is being said in different venues. And is there an early warning that there could be a change in the tariff at a specific point? And, using the large language models again to try and anticipate what that impact could be and the duration of the impact. So I know there's a bit of fickleness right now in terms of how the tariffs are being applied. They have an intent, but if you follow the stated intent, they're supposed to be long-term. And we would want to be able to anticipate when they're going to hit, how they're going to hit, and and what they're going to hit. So there's a way to actually start modeling that using large language. So we're able to convert the knowledge from the large language models to data, then use the data in different analytical approaches.
Thanks for that. And there's still a few more questions in the chat, and I apologize to all that we're not able to get them to all of them in the time that's allotted. But we can help sort of facilitate getting some of those answers after the webinar, because I think there's some good information here. Thank you, Michael and Peter, for taking the time, for you and the team at Technomics for sharing the expertise and the work that you do. And thank you to all of our attendees for your time and your engagement and for participating today. Just a note before we wrap that we have a couple of interesting events coming up here at the Council. For those that have been participating in our municipal webinar series, episode 4 on the P3 procurement process will be held on Tuesday, May 6th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. That session that will be led by Marianne Smith, partner at Blake's Castle and Graydon LLP, and Lisa Roswell, senior solicitor with the City of Winnipeg, will walk people through the full P3 procurement journey, from initial market soundings right through to the business case development, all the way to the contract finalization and financial close. So really interesting stuff for those interested on the municipal side. And also to let everyone know, we will be launching the registration shortly this afternoon for our upcoming spring networking event, which will be held in Ottawa this year on May 28th. We will be hosting our event with a thought-provoking panel discussion on the outcomes of the federal election held on April 28th. So a month later, we hope to have a little bit more insight into the direction of the government and what their cabinet will look like. So it's definitely a can't miss discussion in May. So a huge thank you again, Peter and Michael, for your time today, and to everyone who attended, and enjoy the rest of your day.